Hey folks, welcome back to Threes In. Bobo's here. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about why I became alcoholic. And no, it was not because all the other jobs were filled. I became an alcoholic for a myriad of reasons, and some of which I'm going to discuss here. Now, as I launch into this playlist, into this thread, if you will, you'll hear me sometimes make light of my disease. That's just my way of coping, I suppose. I do not make light of the disease of alcoholism, nor of my recovery. I take that very serious. But dealing day to day with it, you'll see how I handle it. Okay, that being said, a little background. I was raised in a military family. We moved every 2 or 3 years, as was common in those days. I went to 11 schools over the 12 years I went to school. I went to 4 different high schools in 3 different countries over that period. A lot of instability in my life. But then again, I wouldn't trade it for anything, because that life as an Air Force brat was just wonderful. I loved it, truth be told. I loved going to different countries. I loved to learn about their cultures. I loved meeting the people. It was a magic experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Okay, so we get to France in 1962 to a little base called Chambly. And it was a tiny base. We had F-84s there and B-66s. And we commuted 29 miles to Verdun, France, one way. And we'd get up in the morning before light, get on the bus, drive to school. Our school was an old World War I German hospital. And it was surrounded by barbed wire, gray, foreboding. At any rate, we'd get out of school about 4:30. It was dark again, and we'd rode home. That's the way the school year was for the most part. At one point during the year, I stumbled into the nurse's office. I had a chest cold or something going on or another, and she gave me a bottle of this firewater. It was called turpentine hydrate, was the Christian name for it. And I remember going to algebra class, sitting down and taking a swig of it. Damn, that burned. I mean, it burned like hell. It burned, but I loved it. So I took another swig. And that burned too. And then I took a third and perhaps a fourth. Anyway, within 15 minutes, I was well into doing my goes intas, where 2 goes into 4, 4 goes into 8, and so forth, with no problem at all. And I loved that cough syrup. Well, a couple days later, I went back to the nurse's station and hacked up a couple hacks and whatever, and she reached in that big gray locker, that steel gray locker, pulled out another bottle of this stuff, and I suppose that was the start of it. Then I had a very dear friend, a guy named Bill Bowman. And Bill and I were just great buddies. I was a junior, he was a senior. And turns out we began to enjoy drinking together as kids. And he would go into his dad's liquor cabinet, take the vodka, pour some of it down the drain, or into our glasses, and then fill it up with water, put it back, thinking his dad never knew. Anyway, I did not care for vodka, but I loved beer, as it turned out. And one day we went off base down to a little French cafe, and I remember having 3 beers, and this is where it began, I suppose. Once I got past the cough syrup, I had those 3 French beers, and by the time I got back to base, I was sick as a dog. I didn't like the first French beer, but what the hell, I drank the second and then the third, and that was a clue right there. Well, if you didn't like it, why'd you keep drinking it? Well, there's your explanation. So I get home, and I get sick as a dog, and I'm in throwing up, and Mom says, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I got a touch of the flu." You know, that nasty flu stayed with me for the next 31 years, and it kicked my ass. Okay. That should have told me something, drinking French beer. French should stick with the wine and leave the beer to the Germans. And I can vouch for that. But I want to come back to Bill Bowman for a minute. Bill was a very, very dear friend of mine. And I idolized him, I suppose. We were good buddies. We left France and I never heard from him, never saw him again. But I've carried him in my heart all these years. We just connected. In 1994, I got sober. And one of the first things I did, having worked in safety as an aircraft investigator, I knew how to find things, if you will. So I found Bill Bowman's dad up in Montana. And I called him. And I explained to him who I was. And I said, I don't know if you remember or not. And he's, yeah, you're one of those little snots that used to drink my vodka. Jesus. Guilty. So we talked a little bit, and I said, I'm interested in getting hold of Bill if I can. He said, Bobby, Bill passed away about 9 months ago. I said, oh no. And he said, yes. He said he committed suicide. That hit me like a ton of bricks. 9 months ago. And he committed suicide. He said he had gotten into drugs. Of course, he was in the alcohol, but he got into drugs and just couldn't find his way out. And I was just totally heartbroken. And I can tell you, I suppose I want to share with you, when I meet people, I have a tendency I enjoy them. I enjoy meeting you, whether it be in person, just passing by a casual meeting or whatever. But I just enjoy meeting people. I love hearing your stories. And you mean something to me. I remember in Puerto Rico, I hung around with a kid named Jay Carp. And Jay had a brother, Ray Carp. And these two guys were really fantastic baseball players. I was on the team, but that's about as far as I went. But Jay and we did things every day together. I mean, we were like brothers. Anyway, he always talked about living in Tampa. So one day when I was on active duty, we flew into Tampa, into MacDill Air Force Base, and whoever I was flying with had something to do, so they went on their own way. I went over to the officers club, and after a couple beers, I went over and picked up the phone, looked in the phone booth, and looked in the phone book, and found Jay Carp's phone number. So I was so excited to call and make the acquaintance again. When I called him, and explained to him who I was and how I knew him, he couldn't remember me. And I mentioned things that we did together. I mentioned the cookies his mother used to make, the candy she made, the forays we had down to the beach, playing on the beach there at Ramey and so forth. And he just couldn't remember me. And I apologized for bothering him, and I hung up that phone, and that sense of emptiness just clobbered me. I just said, well, maybe I didn't exist. And I think that was some of the residual of the fog of my alcoholism that I had found myself in at that time. So I went back to the bar and dealt with it the only way I knew how. Just had a few more beers and tried to forget about it. So I guess where I'm leading with this line here is, in those early years of development, I never developed coping skills. I substituted alcohol for those coping skills that are so important for developing in life, if you will. I always just turned to alcohol. It was always the first thought. I got up to, we only spent a year in France, thank goodness, and then moved to Germany. And that's when I really got into German beer. I love that stuff. And they didn't make that 3-2 crap. They made real beer. So I was on the soccer team. And again, I wasn't an athlete by any stretch, but I loved running around, because after we ran around, they wore us out with a score of like 19-0 or something on the soccer team. they would always take us to a beer stube and buy the beer. So that was a small price to pay to get free beer. So that was kind of the way it all started. I think I'm going to also mention here I told you a little bit about my family, my parents and so forth. The culture that I grew up in the military at that time, yeah, there was a tremendous amount of drinking that went on. Again, I'll take you back to Ramey here for a minute. One night we had a B-52 crash, and I think almost everybody on board was killed. I'm pretty sure they were. They were doing touch and goes, and something went wrong, and they ended up crashing. I remember seeing the sky light up at night, but I wasn't sure what it was, and then heard about it the next day. On that Friday, everybody mustered at the officers' club there at Ramey, and we were in the pool, as we were prone to do on Friday nights. My parents would go into the bar, and we'd be in the pool till they finished, and then we'd go home. And I remember everybody having toasts to the fallen crew, but I didn't remember seeing anybody. I didn't see a lot of sorrow. They dealt with it with alcohol. And so I kind of filed that in the back of my mind and just let it go. And then I suppose the last element here, and before I began this presentation here, I downloaded a paper on signs of an alcoholic and causes of alcoholism. But I really don't need it. I lived it. So one of the things in here deals with trauma of childhood. Well, when you get the hell beat out of you day in and day out, you don't think of it as trauma. That becomes your normal. And I know it's sick, but that kind of was my normal until I left home, until I left for college in 1964. But I didn't know it was not normal because that was normal. And I could go into that, but I don't think I need to go any further than to say that it could get exciting at times. And I survived. So in 1964, I did leave home, came back to college, and I think this is a good place to stop at this point. I don't offer these things as excuses. The environment, the heritage, the trauma, they're not excuses by any stretch of the imagination, but they perhaps can help people understand. They perhaps can serve as explanations for it. At any rate, I survived and moved on to college, and I had a good time there too. So that being said, this is Bobo Bass Gear Stop.